Bonjour, merci.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us for our next session here at the Rencontre économique d'Aix-en-Provence. This session is focusing on a theme which is going to be very interesting. I've got stuck in with this subject as soon as I found out that I was going to be moderator for this session with all of the specialists before us. The title of the session is How Autonomous is Latin America in the Face of the USA? I want to start with a sentence that Donald Trump said when he came into power. He said, "We don't need them, they need us." That was his answer to a Brazilian journalist who was asking him to define the framework for his Latin America policy. So to what extent can Latin America move beyond the US influence? What role can Latin America play in the various trade wars that have been started by Mr. Donald Trump? We're going to try to find answers to these questions with the specialists who are in front of us, and I want to start by introducing to you, just next to me, Erika Muniz, who is president of the Atlantic Council at the LATAM Center. Then next to her we have Sergio ALCOCER, who is a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He is formerly of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. We have Sarquis, José Sarquis, who is the Brazilian ambassador to the international organizations in Paris. We also have with us Ricardo HAUSMANN, who is founder and director of Harvard's Growth Lab. And good afternoon, and thank you for being here, to José Manuel Salazar-Zirnac, who is the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. This session, this discussion, will be coordinated by Arantxa González Laya. Thank you very much for being with her. Arantxa González Laya is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain and currently Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris. I'm going to ask you to frame the discussion we're going to hear today. Thank you very much, David. We're going to move beyond Europe. We're going to take a trip to Latin America in order to understand the challenges that Latin America has to face in dealing with relating to its North American cousin, its North American relation in the USA. We're going to talk about the opportunities, the challenges, but also some potential ways forward for the continent. Donald Trump's arrival in the White House has obviously caused a certain amount of agitation in the Latin American continent. There have been tariffs even for the countries that already had trade accords with the USA. There's been the refoulement of migrants to countries, even countries that don't comply with human rights. There's an obsession with pushing China out of Latin America. There's been support for far-right or libertarian parties on the part of the US government. There have been some territorial claims, the claims over the Panama Canal, for example. So Donald Trump's arrival has brought a lot of volatility and instability at a time where the continent was calming down after the significant crisis caused by the COVID pandemic. This volatility has a negative impact on the investment appeal and the finance needs for the continent. So what responses can we find for the Latin American continent? First of all, we need to be very lucid and note the power asymmetry, in particular with regard to the smaller countries and the countries that are closer to the USA. The ability to respond to USA actions is limited for these countries. We also need to say that Latin America is not a homogeneous whole. There's a lot of diversity in Central America. You have Mexico, which has a lot of interdependence with the USA. The Central American countries are very well integrated, but then you have the South American continent, which is very diverse. So I think we need to understand some of the micro issues rather than imagining macro-level issues. We need tailor-made responses for each country. And so what should be the responses for countries of the region? In the region, just as for us in Europe, competitiveness and productivity is improving. We need to have economies that are more capable for generating endogenous growth that requires dealing with the informal sector, incorporating women in the labour market, and dealing with issues of criminality, which are very present in some of the continent's economies. There are also significant opportunities in the way that value chains and production chains are being reconfigured around the world. This opportunity particularly presents itself for countries that have commodities and raw materials that are necessary for the green transition and digital transition. So one pathway is about competitiveness. A second pathway is around regional integration. The Latin American region is the region where there is the lowest level of intra-regional trade is lowest, about 15% in Latin America and around 70% in Europe, 50% in Asia. So there is a lot of potential in regional integration. Undoubtedly in Latin America, as in Europe, region will need to turn to other countries and other regions in order to build alliances. There is an alliance on the table between the European Union and the Mercosur bloc. I'm very aware of the sensitivity of this issue in France, but I do believe that at a time like this, where Latin America and Europe are both trying to diversify and find new geopolitical alliances, it would be a potential solution ahead of us. David, we've got a lot of things to discuss, I think. I'm going to hand the floor back to you to take us further. Thank you very much. We have a very broad subject to talk about, so I'm going to first of all hand the floor to José Manuel Salazar Zirina. What should the position of Latin America be faced with a Trump administration? And more broadly, what position should Latin America take in the new geopolitical reality?
Hello? Yes, okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very, very much. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be with these distinguished panelists and some of them very close friends. Look, the question is, can Latin America be autonomous from the US? I mean, that was a version that was put to us. If I had to give a yes or no answer, I would say no. But that in a world that would be simple. Actually, the world is complicated. We have all the geopolitics, so fortunately, we don't have to go for a simple answer like that. And the interesting thing is the analysis. And I want to give you, making honor to the title of this conference, which is Les Chocs de Réalité, the reality shocks, give you some reality checks with some numbers. The first numbers are relative to geopolitics or geoeconomics. The first one is that the basic structure of the world economy has changed tremendously since the year 2000. So in the first 25 years of this century, the share of China in world GDP tripled from 6% in 2000 to 18%. This in purchasing power parity, you can measure it in money, present money terms, is a bit different. The share of emerging and developing Asia more than doubled from 15 to 33%. The share of the United States was reduced 6 points from 21 to 15%. The share of the European Union was reduced 7 points from 22 to 15%. And by the way, the share of Latin America shrank from 9 to 7. So clearly, the distribution of the productive capabilities and in the world economy is now very different from 25 years ago. Europe and the United States are today 15%, China is 18%. A similar change, and there's no time to give you the figures, if you look through the lens of trade statistics. And of course, behind GDP shares and trade shares, there is productive capacities, there is technology, there is industrial potential. China has become a technological powerhouse. Now, these production, trade, and technological changes are very important because they provide the basis to argue that in an ideal world, and I stress in an ideal world, The recommendation for Latin America would be, don't take sides. Just do business with everybody, Make the most of the opportunities, reduce the risks, deal with China and see what China can give you, deal with Europe. And of course, this is win-win. There's a lot of things that Europe can gain, and in fact, in practice, gains from dealings with Latin America. But of course, we don't live in an ideal world, and we have the geopolitics in front of us. So, the other second reality check is that the interdependence of Latin American countries with the United States and also with China and Europe not only has changed in the last quarter century, but is very diverse by countries. There are multiple channels, and I'd like to give you a few figures just on 4 of these channels, which are trade, investment, remittances, and migration. In terms of trade, you can, being simple, divide Latin America in 3 groups. The first group is Mexico on its own. Mexico has 80 or more than 80% of its exports going to the United States. Then you have a second group, which is Central America and the Caribbean, and there the countries are between 30 and 60% of exports going to the United States. That's one league. You go to South America, and the picture is very different. With the exception of Colombia, that has 32% of exports going to the United States, and another country, all the other countries have less than 18% of exports going to the United States, and you have Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay that export less than 10%. So it's a very different kind of relationship. China has displaced the United States as South America's top trading partner. The exports of Latin America to the United States as a share of total exports decreased from 59 in 2000 to 43 today. And imports from the US as a share of total imports decreased from 50 to 30. In the same period, however, the exports of Latin America and Caribbean going to China increased 14 times, from 1 in 2000 to 14% today. And the proportion of imports from China in total imports has grown to 2 to 20. So this means that the exposure also of Latin American and Caribbean countries to tariffs or sanctions or anything from the United States is very different. So it's very asymmetrical. In terms of investment, the picture is very different. The United States continues to be the leading foreign direct investment origin into the region by a wide margin. The figures we have at ECLAC is that 38% of foreign direct investment flows, almost 40%, in 2024 last year came from the United States, compared to 15% from the European Union. And the flows from China are much less than that. Remittances. This is another major channel of interdependence, or mutual dependence, I would say. They account, remittances, for more than 15% on average in several countries in Latin America. For instance, 27% of the GDP in Nicaragua. This is what the remittances of Nicaraguans to Nicaragua represent. 26% in Honduras, 24% in El Salvador, 20% in Guatemala, Jamaica, and Haiti. And again, the difference with South America is enormous, because the remittances represent, on average, less than 1% of the GDP of South America, partly because the numbers are not so large, partly because the GDP of South America is more larger than those of Central American countries. Finally, migration. According to UN estimates, there are 48 million people from Latin America and the Caribbean that live outside their countries, and half of them live in the United States. So, despite all the very intense anti-immigration stance in the current US administration and its deportation campaign, there is hardly a scenario where there are not millions of families living in the United States that are connected to millions of families living in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, in conclusion, and I haven't talked, for instance, about the financial channel, which is, I'm sure Ricardo later is going to talk about that. So, the interdependence and the mutual dependence between Latin America countries and Caribbean countries and the United States through these 4 channels is very extensive, is very dense, and also is very asymmetrical. Of course, the United States has a lot of powers and very strong levers to influence decisions in Latin American countries. So any idea of autonomy or decoupling of Latin American countries from the United States, I don't see very feasible. It could be different. Now, all this is, I don't want to be an economic determinist. All this is the economics. of course, there's the politics, and the politics is different. It's not the same, the kind of stance that you can take if you are Brazil or you are Argentina, for instance, than the kind of stance that if you are, a Costa Rica or El Salvador.
Ok. On va peut-être demander une petite réaction très rapide à chacun d'entre vous.
Let's ask a quick response from everyone about what's just been said. Would you draw the same conclusions or different conclusions? Erika Muinez.
I disagree because I don't understand what the perspective is. All countries around the world are interdependent with one another. That doesn't mean that you can't stand on your ground. I'm assuming the question when you ask whether you're autonomous or not, especially small states, is the question, can you stand on your ground, case in point, Panama or any other? And if the answer implied is no, I strongly disagree with that. I think small states, for the most part, have leverage. They just need to know to identify it and when to use it. This is not to engage on constant Twitter battles, etc., but I think it's a larger point and a very pessimistic one if that is the answer.
Sergio, ALCOCER.
Well, thank you very much. But first of all, I would like to thank Monsieur Lorenzi, Monsieur Posibet for the invitation to the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations to be with you. And I think it's very difficult because Latin America and the Caribbean is a very heterogeneous region. So you cannot have only one answer for everything. And for Mexico, and I can speak for Mexico, of course, the interdependency with the US is huge. So we cannot say that we could be autonomous, and in that regard, I sympathize with what has been done. But that might not be the true for other countries. And the solution for one country is not the same for other countries. But of course, the United States had a very heavy weight within Latin America. And one thing that is very important is if you ask the people in Latin America, through Latino Barometer, who is a poll that is conducted every 3 years, people in Latin America would like to have a relation much closer to the US than to China. I don't know if that has changed now that Donald Trump is in power, but 3 years ago, 2 years ago actually, people preferred to have a relation with the US than in China.
Mr. Sarquis, do you agree with that? Est-ce qu'on peut dire que
Do you agree with that? Should we say that every country needs a tailor-made solution in order to deal with the dependency of the United States?
Consideration national circumstances, especially in international relations, when it comes to trade, to environment, energy transition, sustainable development, and so on and so forth. What I would say is that Latin America has always faced the reality, if we compare to Europe, in relative terms. This crisis we are facing today, this shock coming from the reality, I think has been building there for a while. Let's not forget that trade to GDP globally has been stagnant since 2008. So since then, it's hard to say trade has been the same source of economic growth as it was previously. So what I also wanted to say is that despite responses being national, applied to every specific national circumstances, the more you trade with your neighbor, the more you promote regional integration, the more you create in terms of opportunities and perspectives for trade, economic partnership, investments, and financial flows.
Monsieur Hausmann, je vais vous donner la parole en faisant intervenir un autre acteur.
Mr. Hausmann, I'm going to give you the floor and ask you to talk about another actor. We're talking about China as an arbitrator in some of the economic wars. What are the links between Latin America and China? Is Latin America a collateral victim of the trade war started by Donald Trump? Thank you very much for this question.
Make a point that what we are observing here, and I fully agree with the numbers on Latin America, but what we are witnessing right now is a different experiment. We thought that there were trade rules and that the worst you can do is get most favored nation treatment. But right now, the US is engaging in a one-by-one negotiation, weaponizing, if you want, any leverage they have on you. So the question is, if you are put in a situation where they're going to weaponize any leverage they have on you, what is your response? Obviously, the first response is that you want to diversify your risk as much as possible. The US, put in Biden's time the idea that we needed to de-risk from China. Well, now we need to de-risk from the US. Now, what are the limits to that de-risking? I would say that Latin American states face two kinds. First of all, I mean, in the trade, it's an open question. If you export oil, Brazil exports oil to the US, or it doesn't matter too much to Brazil if it goes to the US, if it goes to a third country. So that leverage is not that significant. The bulk of South America produces minerals and proteins, and those all go to China. So the US can do whatever, but it's not going to sever the trade relationship between South America and China. It's just that it is a natural relation. That's where the complementarity is. The problem arises in two topics. The first one is that many Latin American countries have very weak fiscal numbers, and they depend on IMF support or IMF blessing for them to maintain access to capital markets, for them not to have a debt crisis. And the IMF right now, even though its Director General is always a European, is an institution where you have to be in very good terms with the US Treasury. If you want IMF money, you have to be in good terms with the US Treasury. So that's one dependence. And it's one dependence that the Europeans have allowed to happen. So it's the defense of multilateralism would have to come by a greater independence of the IMF from the US Treasury. That's one element. And the second element that makes them dependent, and we don't know on exactly whom, is the fact that many Latin American states are being contested by large, well-armed criminal organizations. There's kind of like an ongoing battle between the state and internationally connected criminal organizations. It's happening in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Mexico, in Ecuador, in Bolivia. It's across the region. So there is one group of countries that would like to have an international support in their fight against criminal organizations. And there's another group of countries that think that the international support is too complicated, that they can consolidate power by making alliances with the criminal organizations. So right now we have Venezuela is in an alliance with its own criminal organizations as a way to consolidate the regime against others that would favor things like democracy and human rights. You see that tendency happening in Colombia, where the president right now is trying to consolidate power by allying himself with criminal organizations. That's sort of like the dynamic right now in Bolivia. But you have countries like Ecuador that are right now in a frontline battle with the criminal organizations that need support. So if you look at this question, say, from Ecuador, you would say, I need IMF money, I need support to battle the criminal groups. That's my dependence, that's what I need to find support for. And that, I think, opens up a very interesting role if Europe wanted to help Latin America de-risk from the US.
Monsieur Salazar-Xirinache, est-ce que vous avez, vous, quelque chose à dire, un petit commentaire à faire sur ce qui vient d'être dit?
Do you have a comment on what's just been said?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to react. Well, look, I don't want to be misunderstood. When I say no, I said, it was like a provocation at the beginning and basically an invitation to be sophisticated in the analysis, which is what everyone that has spoken, has said. And I think in this sophistication, actually the answer is no Latin American country can be independent, neither of the United States, autonomous, or China, or Europe. we are very deeply interconnected. That was my message. We are, you know, we're all interdependent and mutually dependent. So I think that's why this is a call to pragmatism, really. And I think this is what we should be. Now in the new geopolitics, also I must say, Latin America has a lot of assets that the world is interested in, and that we have to, as a Latin American country, make the most of it. We have water, we have biodiversity, we have strategic minerals. There are countries that, you know, have the largest reserves of lithium in the world. So for the decarbonization of the world, and this is something Ricardo has stressed and written a lot about, and we also at ECLAC, you know, there's a huge demand for this. But it's not only that. There is oceans, there is you know, tourism. So there is a lot of good business, quality business that will actually you know, bring growth and quality jobs to Latin America. So that's a big part of the conversation, economic, you know, diplomacy and scientific diplomacy that Latin America should have with the other countries. The problem, well, that's another thing, I know I must finish, but is that you have to deal with these things, hopefully, you know, and ideally, in a world where countries respect rules and respect certain rules of the game, which is not quite happening now.
ALCOCER?
Well, I just wanted to stress that maybe one of the three main problems in Latin America are inequalities, security, and migration. And they were problems that were not related to each other many years ago. Now they are totally intertwined. So when you talk about migration, there is security involved, and there is an inequality behind it. And when you ask yourselves, being here a European, French person, what can I do to support a change in Latin America? And I think this is very important because we have been striving in Latin America to be much closer to the European Union, not because we want to de-risk from the US, because we think that we have some Western values of those that we share with you. We think that you promote and respect the human rights and defend the human rights, which is critical in many countries in Latin America. We also think that climate change and the energy transition are also critical for a country and for a region like mine. So that's why it's so important to have the European Union voice vis-a-vis Latin America. And so in some sessions before, there was a lady that was asking, what can we do for the energy transition? So I will challenge you, what can you do to help us in Latin America to change the populism in which we live, in which we don't have a reality check every single time we change the rules, as it has been said. We are becoming more autocratic in the region, and we have these incredible inequalities in the region. I think having a voice from the European Union and from France, of course, being l'égalité, fraternité, etc., of course it will make a lot of sense for us to hear that voice quite often.
Erika Mouines, est-ce que vous avez quelque chose à ajouter là-dessus?
Oui.
Do you have anything to add?
Perspective, Sergio's point, and that's rather than having Europeans come out and help Latin Americans, because we need the help, think of us as strategic partners because we have the wealth. We have resources, as it was mentioned here, minerals you can go on, but you're thinking about biodiversity, that's also there. Oil was mentioned here. So I think migration specifically gave us a bad rep. And now, every time the conversation is drawn and is talked about Latin America, people think of they need money, they need support, they need aid. And yes, we have problems, structural problems, as it was discussed here, like organized crime, etc. But there is also a lot of opportunity, untapped opportunity for Europeans.
On va parler justement de l'Europe avec vous.
We're going to talk about Europe with you, José Sarquis. What should we think of the relationship between Latin America and Europe? Is there a front that could be imagined to curb the attacks by the US? And how should we consider relationships between the EU and the Mercosur? Thank you, excellent question. My answer would be clear, yes. Latin America
has big potential. We have done a lot, but we still need to do much more. The reality, the way I see, is one in which there is a weakening of multilateralism. And these two regions, they share similar values: democracy, governance, transparency, accountability, human rights, multilateral stance, a conviction that multilateral institutions are important. Beyond that, the reality that I see is one in which there is fragmentation, there is somehow deglobalization, but interdependence remains an important part of the structure. And we see a multipolar order being reviewed step by step, even if in contradictory terms. G20, in a way, revealed that. The BRICS is also revealing that development of a multipolar order. Of course, with that, there is the weakening of multilateralism, and hopefully Latin America, the EU, Mercosur, would be important multipolar forces in revigorating multilateralism. The way forward, the way I see, is by greater integration between these two regions, based on the shared principles, on the shared view of multilateral institutions, and beyond that, many complementarities. Latin America has abundance of water, land, biodiversity, resources to bioeconomy, sustainable and renewable sources of energy. Brazil, for instance, has 90% of its electricity generation based on renewable sources. Latin America, 60%. This is the region that has the highest share of renewables in its energy matrix, in electricity generation. Europe is lagging behind, despite all the efforts Europe is doing in terms of renewables. So there is potential for greater partnership in clean manufacturing. And there is also the reality of economic data. China is becoming more and more an important partner, for sure, in Mexico and Central America for a long while. It's also becoming an important partner, the most important partner in trade terms to Mercosur, to South America. But still, Europe remains a key economic partner. It has the highest share of FDI stock in Brazil. It generates jobs in Brazil. It trains engineers. Brazilian companies and European companies, French, Spanish, German, Italians, they do a lot of partnerships, and partnership in engineering, in infrastructure. And this is the agenda ahead of us.
Petite réaction, Ricardo HAUSMANN.
Quick reaction, Ricardo HAUSMANN, on what was said. Do you think that multilateralism, the European style, would work with all the countries of Latin America? Well, I think that, first of all, there are two things I would like to say. En anglais, in English.
Multilateralism, global multilateralism, I think, is one topic. But that implies multilateralism with the non-democracies. And what I see weakened is the democratic bloc. So we need leadership in consolidating democracies and in helping recover democracies, right? I see, for example, Brazil is very much in love with BRICS, and BRICS starts with a B, which is for Brazil, but it includes Russia, and it includes China, which are not exactly democracies. And right next to Brazil is Venezuela, but Brazil has not been overly enthusiastic about the defense of Venezuelan democracy, right? If anything, you might say that it has been helpful to Maduro, a Brazilian foreign affairs strategy. So I would want to see a strong democratic pole, and I think that Europe can naturally lead that democratic pole. And so that's my concern there. I wanted to say something to agree with Sarquis. We have energy resources, green renewable energy resources. Let me say why this is strategic for Europe. And I think this is a point that Europe has, I don't think that it has been made enough in Europe. The oil era was an era in which transporting energy was incredibly cheap. If a barrel of oil costs $70 in Saudi Arabia, it will cost $72 in Rotterdam. But that meant that if you had an energy-intensive industry, the fact that you were energy poor didn't matter. You could just bring in the energy. In a green world, that's not going to be the case, because green energy is ridiculously expensive to move. So instead of sending the energy to where the industries are, you'll have to relocate the industries where the green energy is. And if you don't do that, you'll just lose those energies, those industries. So I think that one strategic element to save as many jobs as possible in Europe is to put the most energy-intensive parts of industry near green resources, and those happen to be in Latin America. That's what's strategic for Europe.
On va accélérer un petit peu parce qu'il reste moins de 20 minutes pour aborder.
We have to speed up now because we have less than 20 minutes to cover other topics that are very important. I'll turn to Sergio ALCOCER to ask him, what are the issues related to custom policies and the control of migrations? How did the return of Donald Trump change things in terms of inequality, security, safety, and migration flows? What should we understand by this change?
The migration issue between Mexico and the U.S. has been historically complex. And during the Second World War, Mexican immigration was significant because of the loss of workforce that was needed in the U.S. to just to have the crops growing. And then in the 1960s, in the Kennedy administration, when the rules were changed in order to prohibit certain populations to go into the U.S., then that became, that immigration that was sort of legal and was a circle immigration became illegal. Since then, the relation related to Mexican immigration has been very complex. Just last year, we have 1.4 million people at the border between Mexico and the U.S. from 177 countries. 177 countries. Not only Mexicans, not only Guatemalans or Hondurans or Salvadorians. We have people from Ukraine, from Haiti, from many places. So the immigration issue is always a problem in the relations between the U.S. and certainly with President Donald Trump is one of those issues. It's one of the central policies. And I understand that for a country to decide how this country wants to have its population being composed, it makes sense to control immigration. But the thing is, one of the, I would say, schizophrenic things within the U.S. is that the large majority of minorities in the U.S. are from Hispanic origin. There are about 60 million people from Hispanic origin in the U.S. Just 30 million people from Mexican origin, from first, second, and third generation. Right now, there are sort of 11 million people in the U.S., half of them without documents. Illegal for the U.S., we call it undocumented immigration. So it's a huge phenomenon that the Republican Party doesn't want to recognize, that is changing the demography in the U.S. It will change the color of the skin of the people that actually go to a baseball game. Not only the WASPs that we were used to, well, now we will see other colors of the skins like Hispanics. And I think this is the kind of cultural shift that is occurring within the U.S. And of course, Donald Trump represents the pushback against the immigration. That's why he's against immigration. Certainly, he has achieved a tremendous reduction in immigration in the past just few months because of his stance on immigration. But I wonder if that could be maintained. Of course, they approved the one big, incredible and beautiful bill and what have you. And certainly, we have humongous amount of resources to build the wall, to have a much larger border patrol and so forth. However, there is an intertwining in terms of immigration related to the jobs that are needed in the U.S. You go to the U.S. and then you want someone to work in manufacturing. There is no American that wants to work in manufacturing. There is no American that wants to work in the service area. So that's why people like Mexicans or other origins are willing to work in those areas. So in this immigration, just blinding or trying to close their eyes to what is needed within the country by just closing the borders, I don't think it's going to work. But I think time will tell.
Je vois que M. Salazar-Xirinac approuve ce que vous venez de dire. Un peu.
I think you approve what you say. A quick comment on what was said. What do you think of the migration policy held by Donald Trump today?
Fully agree. No, look, I mean, this was one of the 4 channels that I mentioned, you know, in terms of interdependence, mutual dependence. I think what has been said, you know, there's an additional element, there's demographic change. You know, there are statistics that also the fertility rates of Hispanics in the United States are higher than the fertility rates of US citizens. So actually, not just because of new flows that are going to be unstoppable, but because of the natural growth, demographic growth of the population, there's going to be a huge change in the balance of the United States. And that's going to affect, you know, the culture. And ultimately be, you know, I think good news in the future. But I want to say, you know, one aspect, now that I have the word, if I may, or you're going to have another round of questions?
Just 30 seconds.
Very quickly, because in our basic diagnosis of Latin America and the Caribbean, we see the region in 3 development traps. And the first trap is a low capacity to grow, which is really a tragedy. You know, let me just give a couple of figures. In the decade between 2014 and 2023, the average growth of Latin America was only 0.9%. This was less than the 2% average growth of the famous lost decade of the 80s. So we are saying Latin America already lost a second, you know, decade. And the question is, are we going to lose a third decade? So everything that we have been talking about, you know, doing business with China, with Europe, with the United States, and not because of aid. This is not an argument for help me, no. This is an argument for let's be partners, you know, let's do business, let's be smart. Ricardo was very eloquent in saying what the competitiveness of Latin American and Caribbean countries can be, you know, in the area of, you know, bringing factories, attracting investment. And if you go through medical devices, pharmaceutical industry, we have in ECLAC identified 15 dynamizing sectors that could be a wealth of opportunities. And this is what we need to talk about.
Je voudrais me tourner vers Monsieur Sarquis parce que
I'd like to turn to Mr. Sarquis. We don't see Brazil, a country you come from, as a country of emigration. How do you, what do you think about this, the policies held by Trump today?
Brazil has been, for a long while in its history, a very much open country, open economy to migrants. I myself, I'm a grandchildren of Lebanese who went to Brazil to build their lives, and successfully, as many immigrants. We are in a difficult moment in which countries are reacting in a very protectionist way. And I think this is the response to the stagnant trade to GDP ratios that we have seen since 2008. As I said earlier, there are opportunities, and as Ricardo said on his speech for Europe to be strategic, I would say both Latin America and Europe, Mercosur and the European Union have to be strategic, based on their shared values. I think they can build platforms for integration, people-to-people exchanges, including migration, based on trade, more trade between themselves, more investments, more in terms of generation of jobs, and a contribution to sustainable development, clean production, and good chains, economic change, and with that, pushing forward their values internationally as we build a multipolar and rebuild the multilateral order.
Alors, je voudrais redonner la parole à Erika Muines pour lui poser la question de savoir de quels outils dispose les plus petits pays, parce que
What tools do the smaller countries have? We said Latin America is a region that's very heterogeneous, but the smaller countries, what tools do they have available to resist to international pressure, notably those coming from the U.S.? The pressure.
The outlook looks bleak for smaller nations, but I am of a positive view, and as I mentioned earlier, see, we can be a collateral damage in between fights of giants. I think that's the wrong approach, but that implies choosing sides. We shouldn't be looking for sides. We should be looking for issues. That's a completely different perspective. That means that when you go with an agenda, right now, most countries are getting there as goalkeepers. How do I block? How do I protect so I don't get 2 goals? And I think that's strategically wrong. You're gonna get damaged no matter what. You need to come up with an agenda, a quiet one. And again, I can't stress enough, in diplomacy, you become efficient if you understand the context. Here is a battle where if you're trying to outsmart the headline or the Twitter battle, you're going to lose. But that's not what you need, right? We're not looking for a headline. We're not looking for a specific tweet. We're looking for specific gains. Small states have critical strategic assets. They need to find them, identify and catalog, this is what I have, and decide what is it that you want to push forward. So when you sit at the table, you're not playing goalkeeper, but rather you have strategic gains that you want and what you're able to give. And the standing on your ground, what is sort of like the red line that you're not going to cross, is absolutely crucial. Sovereignty for any country should not be something that you're deciding or that another country, and it is surreal that in 2025 we're still thinking about these ideas. That's not something for anybody to have on the table. And for each country to stand on their ground, and then, you know, just like in a sport, when you're looking to beat another team, you team up with others. You figure out what is the strategy. How can I think of, for instance, Canada's approach on the T-bills and what they did, gaining support from other markets. That's an example of how you see this interaction that is doable. Is it easy? Absolutely not. Obviously, it's not easy, and I think we've highlighted here enough some of the imbalances and clearly the dependence that has been historic. But, you know, like when we were talking, for instance, on growth and how we have been stagnant and sort of what we've missed out in generations, I am a huge, huge proponent of AI for Latin America. I bet that in this audience, not many know that just behind US and India is Latin America as the biggest user. And when we think about, for instance, education, we were never going to catch up if we kept with the same curriculum. But now AI has given us this amazing tool to go out to the highlands where there is no connection, no broadband, and still deliver education, and so on. So I end by saying, and we mentioned this coming here, that AI is giving us tools that, for instance, smaller states that are investing heavy amounts on lobbying firms because they want to get an advantage with the US or the Trump administration, they're losing their money. This is not an administration that is going to give you an advantage by millions of dollars spent on Washington. If there's something that we can pick up positive, and we should recognize it as such, is that there is no game of lobbying, there is no fake agenda. I think he is direct in what he wants, and it is up to the other states to decide, do I give it or not?
Et je vais donner le mot de la fin à Arantxa González, qui a...
Final words to Arantxa González, who opened this roundtable and concluded. What have you retained from everything that was said during this discussion in 1 hour? Well, 2 messages, first of all. In a world of interdependency, not of independency, interdependencies. There are levers, and we have to know how to use them and use them in a smart way, in a pragmatic way. The second message I take away I think it's an important message, given where we are, is that while Europe is lost and looking for itself, there are a lot of countries in the world who are waiting for Europe. In the defense of democracy, in the fight against organized crime, waiting for Europe to move on the defense of multilateralism, for example, and for the construction of solid alliances with others. And so at this time where Europe is concerned by itself, it should keep some energy to develop alliances, notably with Latin America. Thank you very much, David. Thank you. Thank you all for taking part in this discussion, and I hope that it will have given you some fuel for thought. Thank you for being with us and paying such good attention.